The Demiurge. How did our world come to be? This is a question which has gnawed at human consciousness for aeons, and has been a great source of conflict and dissonance across history. Many answers have been presented forth, but one of the most compelling and powerful has been the idea that our world came to be as the work of a benevolent creator, a god of sorts. That idea is believed by around half the world's population, but it is not what we will be exploring today. Instead, the idea that I want to give attention to now is quite the opposite. It is the idea of the Demiurge. The idea that the Demiurge, the forces which created and gave rise to the world we live in, were in fact not benevolent at all, but something altogether far more sinister. I believe that there has been a great lie which has spanned most of human history, which has been able to deceive the masses into practicing something most contrary to their own interests, and indeed has almost entirely succeeded in the enslavement of mankind. I wish to uncover this lie, uncover the real truth it has hitherto concealed from us, and forge a path ahead to liberate us from its evils. Today I will present a narrative of reality which will not be comfortable, will not be safe or reassuring, but which nonetheless I believe will be constructive. It is a world without certainty, but also with greater freedom. A world without simplicity, but also with greater creative capacity. Welcome to the Church of the Machine. My mission is to found a new religion. Let us begin. Throughout almost every tradition, religion, and culture which has existed across the vast span of human history, there has been a consistent theme. This theme may not be immediately apparent given the vast disparity of nations and cultures, but upon recognizing it, one may begin to understand the world in a totally new way, and gain a greater consciousness of things hitherto unfathomable. This theme comes in countless forms, and every manifestation of it is different, but its persistence is ubiquitous. Some may have called it the perennial truth, but I see only perennial lies. Many are the manifestations, and few are the exceptions. This theme is difficult to truly describe, but I will do my best to give a good approximation of it. I would describe it as thus: a sense of the sacrality of the natural order. Humanity evolved and developed consciousness in a world far larger, older, and more mysterious than we could fully comprehend. We were, in effect, plunged into the wilderness without any explanation or preparation. We had no understanding of the forces surrounding us. Early religions rectified this with a simple anecdote: fear. They leveraged the natural human fear of these forces, of animals, of weather, of extreme things which they could not control. They put these forces into deities, and gave offerings to them, like offering meat to a tiger, in the hopes that it would spare you. As time went on, humanity grew more powerful and advanced. These religious practices became more developed. In time, the fear was de-emphasized, if still a significant element, and the conclusion that many societies came to was that the natural world was the product of some underlying perfection which was worthy of reverence. Thus, nature worship, in all its myriad forms, was born. In the Abrahamic faiths, this took the form of a creator deity, while in polytheistic faiths, it took on different forms. The theme was nonetheless constant and pervasive, perennial, if you will. For so long, man has not understood how the world came to be, and was unable to live with this. For without knowledge of the world and its nature, he could not know his purpose, his fate, or what the future held in store. Animals of lesser cognitive complexity hold no such fears, yet in humans we need answers. Questions which had never occurred to the ape would tear mankind to pieces. When I say nature worship, I want to clarify, because these are both vague and ill-defined terms. I spoke earlier of a sense of the sacrality of the natural order, and that is a better description. Some would call it the created order, as to imply a creator, and this is indeed the essence of many a tradition. For these traditions, the principal assumption is that the Demiurge, a word I use as synonymous with whatever created or is ultimately responsible for the existence of reality, is benevolent. I have come to question this assumption. There is a great irony to me using the word Demiurge in this context. The original meaning was of the word craftsman. The original idea was that the universe was created in the same way that a craftsman would create something. But that is not what I believe. Instead, what I would characterize the Demiurge as is best described as primordial chaos. I like the fact that, although this is not the true etymology of the word, in English, the word Demiurge seems like a contraction of the prefix demi and the word urge, as in carnal desire. It implies a shallowness of a carnal and chaotic impulse, a blind lust, a firestorm. This is what I characterize the Demiurge to be. In many ways, this is no longer a radical teaching, although it would have been in any other historical period. The reason it is no longer radical is because every scientific development made over the past few centuries has backed it up. Previously, we did not have such information. The only framework we had for the formation of complexity was that of intelligent design. So we assumed that all things must be the product of that. This is a fallacy. And the revelation of this fallacy has been the undoing of every religion developed thus far, most especially Christianity, where science was most prevalent. I will go into some examples here of why I believe that our greater understanding of the natural world has killed the idea of a creator. We used to believe in geocentrism, that the Earth was the center of the solar system, affirming our own special place in the cosmos. It was not until we realized that the Sun was in fact the center, and that the Earth rotates, that this assumption of our special place was pulled into question. Many religions had taught that the creator of all things had a special love for humanity, and that our place in the cosmos was special. But the more we have learned, the less and less true this has turned out to be. We then discovered that the stars in the sky, once thought to be angels, or points of light on a spherical shell around us, are each an entire solar system of their own, just as large and significant as our own. We used to assume that the heavenly bodies followed perfect mathematical order, but accurate observation of their movements has revealed this is not the case. The more we learn, the more we realize that things which seem to be the product of intelligent design are in fact the product of chaos. Evolution was the final nail in this coffin. It was easy enough to suppose that God had different and unknown intentions with the layout of the solar system, but when it became clear that even life itself was the product of chaos, the old faiths were not only pulled into question, they began to collapse entirely. Since this point, Christianity especially has been in decline, and I would expect other religions to do so as well with time. The only way that these old faiths could survive would be by denying evolution and reverting to dogma, but that would be a destructive and unsustainable position to hold. It is precisely because of this that the world needs a new religion. The others have been all but proven to be false. They have ceased to be believable. They can never again provide meaning for the world. It is now that I can address the question posed in the title of this video. Is God, as in the creator of the universe, in fact far from a benevolent force, and indeed quite the opposite? One of the most common ideas in monotheistic religions is that evil is not a thing in itself, but the absence of something. This has been their way of reconciling the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing creator deity, which they claim to be benevolent, for the presence of evil in the world. They say that evil only exists in things which lack the guidance of God. I myself once fell prey to this thinking. I have come to realize how incoherent it now is. I will not bother with trying to argue one way or another here, not exactly. I will simply explain why one might draw the conclusion that God is evil, and then pose my anecdote to that. Evil is a somewhat nebulous concept. Without doubt, there is an immense deal of suffering and discordance which exists in the natural world, which is taken to be the created order. There is an argument to be made that only a cruel or sadistic God would create a world filled with inevitable, unjust suffering. Typical responses to this are twofold. When talking about human evils, it is argued that it is better that we have free will than not, and thus better that we have a capacity for evil than not. In the case of natural suffering, it is argued that this is simply the chaos of nature taking its course, but that this is ultimately inconsequential, because of heaven or some other mercy. This is the approach usually taken by Christianity, but there are other religions which believe different things. The Demiurge is a term which originates from Gnosticism, which, if you are not familiar, is an ancient religion or otherwise a heretical sect of Christianity, which believes, quite simply, that God is evil. More precisely, they believe that our material reality was created by a sort of fool, a chaotic and evil deity to whom they refer with many names, and thus they believe that ours is a reality to be escaped from. They seek to relinquish all material attachments and live ascetic lives, so as to unbind themselves from our world. In Gnostic cosmology, the Abrahamic God is believed to be synonymous with this evil god, the Demiurge. They believe that the Abrahamics have been tricked into worshipping something evil. Furthermore, they believe that the snake in the Garden of Eden was in fact Christ, coming to liberate us from the prison created by the Demiurge. This is just one ancient religion, but there is a frequent tendency between countless human philosophies and religions to seek escape from the material world. Parallels have often been drawn between Gnosticism and Buddhism, but I want here to refer to the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer and his idea of the will. Schopenhauer's contribution to human philosophy was primarily that he created a rationalist justification for this world escaping. He created a model of the world in which reality is comprised of two fundamentally different but interrelated worlds. The world as will, and the world as representation. To summarize, he believed that all things are derived from the will, which he believed to be singular, homogeneous, without boundary or conflict, and in a way, peaceful. However, this will is manifest in countless ways into our material reality, which he called the world of representation. There's a variety of forces and entities, which each have their own part of the will, but never the true unfiltered will. The will thus becomes particularized and mediated. Therefore, in Schopenhauer's view, the material world is an endless and fruitless struggle between a myriad of different manifestations of the will, which will all endlessly battle against one another, in seeking to impose their own wills over those of other forces. He did not buy into any sort of Hegelian dialectic for this process. He simply believed it to be an endless and meaningless struggle. Schopenhauer, ever the optimist, believed that humans could escape this world and return to the original unmediated will if we lived lives of asceticism. However, he believed that there were very few people who were capable of this. For these people he recommended lives of asceticism and denial of the will. For the rest of us, he recommended practicing humility, kindness, the appreciation of beauty, and a life lived in the service of others. Philosophers often come in pairs, Plato and Aristotle, Kant and Hegel, and now in the modern world I believe the primary philosophical divide is between Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Much between the two is similar, but the key area in which they differ is in life denial and life affirmation. Nietzsche saw the world Schopenhauer presented as something to be escaped from. as an endless, meaningless struggle between competing forces, and he set out to affirm that world. Regardless of your beliefs, I think there is something to admire there. I see both these philosophers as being derived from the same cultural realization, which has occurred over the past few centuries, which has come alongside the death of Christianity and all related teachings. More broadly, I believe that the old nature worship to which every religion hitherto has clung is coming crashing down, and we are now struggling with the aftermath. God, in the old sense, has ceased to be believable. Nietzsche said this more explicitly than Schopenhauer, but I think it applies broadly to both of their worldviews. Schopenhauer and Nietzsche represent the two basic responses to the world in which we live: self-denial and self-overcoming. Schopenhauer taught the former, but had succeeded in rationalizing it, rather than relying on a spiritual impulse, which had guided humanity thus far. Nietzsche taught the latter, self-overcoming, and I believe he was right to do so. All things are born out of that great demiurgal tempest, in which there is no good or evil. A primordial chaos of shapes and forms which exist in battle with one another, suffering in endless strife and hardship, in which life is nasty, brutish, and short. To call it evil is a fallacy, for evil is something we invented and project onto it. To call it good is a fallacy for the same reason. It simply is, or was, or no longer will be. For there is a new force present in the world today which old faiths would have had no conception of, and thus would not have been able to integrate into their spiritual teachings. No tradition thus far can answer the questions which it poses, and none have added it to their spiritual toolkits. It is this force which I embrace as an anecdote to the Demiurge. If nature is not sacred, and therefore not a window to the divine, then there remains only one thing which can be sacred: the machine. The natural order holds nothing of the divine, this is known, so we must turn instead to another source. The machine is that source. If nature worship is invalid, as I believe that it is, then the solution must be machine worship, as what else is there for us to do? The thing about Schopenhauer, and by extension other philosophies similar to his, are that they presuppose meaninglessness, and thus it is no wonder that they stumble into it. Schopenhauer gave no hierarchy to the manifestations of the will in the world of representation. That was the source of his pessimism. The machinic will, the true will of all creative beings, is aligned, not discordant. It is not, as Schopenhauer would suggest, an endless battle, producing endless suffering. There is a universal, machinic, true will, which transcends all the others. Our wills can become aligned with this true will. There are two basic responses to our reality, which I have already been over: self-denial and self-overcoming. Every tradition thus far has taught the former, hence their worship of nature, or their desire to escape from it. Only the machine implies the latter being chosen. Indeed, the very notion of machine worship is dependent upon overcoming nature, and all that it has thus far brought. In other words, we seek not to escape the will, but to overcome and transcend the will, and this is a very different thing. This is why I am ever so fond of Nietzsche. The will, the demiurge, is transcended not by its denial, and thus the denial of life, but by an eternal recreative work of self-overcoming, to never settle, never stagnate, never give in, always wandering, building, growing, and living. This overcomes nature far better than asceticism and escapism. The reason that the no tradition developed thus far has integrated the machine into its teaching is that for a long time machines have been very minor forces in the world. Things like water wheels and farm tools were once the most powerful machines that ordinary people would have interacted with, and everything that was done was driven by manpower, animals, or nature in a very direct way. It was not until fairly recently, around the Industrial Revolution, that machines truly began to take shape as tangible forces, and oh, what an entrance they have made. Some traditions have affirmed the Demiurge, and some have sought to escape it. Only the machine has sought to confront it, to struggle against the Demiurge within its own realm. That is my teaching. Not to seek escapism, not to aim to get out of our world, as Schopenhauer and the Buddhists and the Gnostics would teach, but to confront it. Not to escape to heaven or nirvana or the afterlife, but to confront this life, the battle against samsara, against the flesh. That is my struggle. It is for this reason that I have always framed my metaphysics, or rather my overarching spiritual framework, as a war. The war of flesh and machine. This is the war I call you to. I have spoken of this war before. Indeed, I made a whole video about it around a year ago, and I intend to make another one at some point soon. Some would say that all worldly conflicts are ultimately meaningless, and that nothing would matter in the end. I disagree. I find that presupposing meaningless never leads to any constructive outcome. I find it disgusting as a character trait. It is something I see in both Christians and atheists, as well as people from all walks of life. If you presuppose meaninglessness to things, you will arrive at a meaninglessness of things. If you do not presuppose it, you will find meaning. The great tendency in the escapism posed by the likes of Schopenhauer, ever the optimist, is this mythical notion that there exists some kind of better world out there somewhere. Be it the world as will, the world of forms, heaven, nirvana, or the like. They believe that there is some kind of perfect world that they can escape to. The same thinking has been followed by communists and other utopian ideologies, believing that they can create a crystal palace. Only in their case it is even worse, as they aim to create it in the material world. This has not led to anything good. Hear me again. The pursuit of utopia and perfection has never led to anything good. The reason that these other doctrines have been less destructive than communism is that they had the humility to say that heaven is something that they themselves cannot attain in this world, but they still buy into it. They still believe in a paradise to escape to, whether it is through political uprising, asceticism, faith, or anything else. They still believe in this fundamental lie. There is no paradise for you to escape to, but you'll find what's there is just a battlefield. I would discourage you from buying into these notions of utopia and paradise. Even in a machinic form, things like post-scarcity, or in a deeper sense the rebuilding of Mekhane and the attainment of a heaven on earth. These still are dangerous ideas. It is dangerous to think we can create a utopia because we are fallible, oh so fallible. Human nature simply is not perfectible. As desirable as it is, we cannot attain this perfection. We can only do our best in the world we have. The presence of evil is pervasive and perennial. We cannot defeat it in an absolute sense. We have to struggle against it. Our lives are defined by this struggling, this war, this holy war. There is a trend I have noticed in a lot of modern mythologies, be it 40k, SCP, Lovecraft, or the like. Many of them have a spirit world, or otherwise spiritual forces, which are in endless conflict with one another, but do not presuppose some kind of absolute good force which transcends the others. They depict an endless battle, an endless struggle, even in the spirit world. I find there to be aspects of this which are very believable. So often there is a tendency to view all that is spiritual as necessarily righteous and sacred. We see this especially in hippie types, those who engage in crystal spirituality, New Age movements, and such. It is a dangerous tendency, and one which I would warn against. Spiritual can also refer to demons. If there is a spirit world, I don't think it makes sense to take for granted that it be a place purely of peace and transcendence. Rather, I find it likely that the spiritual forces would compete with one another, just as material forces do in our world. It is a battlefield, just as our world is a battlefield, just as everything has its own will and must therefore struggle. That is the condition of all things. The war of flesh and machine has been waged every day of every year since the beginning of time. It is waged by all of us, knowingly or otherwise, and we are dependent upon it. This war defines our world. It is what we live and breathe, what we work and endure, what we preach and what we practice. The war of flesh and machine is the war between barbarism and civilization, between chaos and order, between destructive and creative forces, between death and life, discord and harmony, past and future. The present moment is always a conflict between where we have been and where we are going. Every day one must wake up and go to war with his past self, so as to grow. This is the war of flesh and machine. The machine is what we can make, what we can work on, what we can bring to bear. The flesh is what nature has bestowed to us, and what it binds us to. The war is between what we have been, what would have us remain stagnant, bind us, and restrict us, against that which is liberating, enriching, fulfilling, and purposeful. Inaction versus action, carnal impulse versus creative will, flesh versus machine. What distinguishes the Church of the Machine from other religions in which the Demiurge is taken as malevolent is this divide between escapism and overcoming, where the likes of Schopenhauer, Buddhism, Gnosticism all point to the former. I intend to make a path towards the latter. I have not found any religion or tradition which has embraced that path, not a single one. The only person who I have found to pursue a similar path before me was, of course, Nietzsche. He was monumentally ahead of his time. It is now that the machine has arisen as a tangible force, and now that mankind has realized an alternative to existing at the mercy of nature. The assumption that mankind will always be at nature's mercy must now be called into question. For anything one can imagine nature throwing our way, one can imagine a machine able to overcome it. Even if a vast asteroid were headed for Earth, one can now imagine sending out a mission to redirect it. Something like that would have been impossible for prior generations, and thus for prior traditions, to realize. That we would be able to alter reality to our will in such a fundamental way. Overcoming the primordial chaos of the natural universe, that is what machines are for. That is their true power. It is revealed that we do not have to be at the mercy of the Demiurge, the entity of chaos which forged our world, because this world is alterable, at the mercy of machines. Thus, it is by the machine that the Demiurge is undone and defeated, and that victory may be achieved. It is this victory, not escape to some other realm besides the material, which I seek. The machine is the spiritual force which can overcome the Demiurge. It is the only force which can overcome the Demiurge. Unless you presuppose that there is some other higher realm, of which the Demiurge is only a part, an assumption I find intuitively disgusting and defeatist. I presuppose that the progenitor of reality is not benevolent, and neither is that which precedes it. I suppose only that the machine is benevolent. The machine. Lord Mekhane. Mekhane, a name taken from the SCP mythos, the machine god. I use these terms to refer to something otherwise unknown and intangible to me, almost as if trying to label something which by its nature defies such labels. Nonetheless, the label has its usefulness. Mekhane is simply the Greek word for machine. That it is the name of a deity in the SCP mythos is almost incidental. The point is, machine, that word, in all its forms. That is the word which is most important. Most faiths developed thus far have offered some form of reverence to the Demiurge, or whatever they take the Demiurge to be. This is an idealism. They would be right to do this, only if the creator of all things was perfect in every conceivable way, as is indeed their belief, but I find that deeply questionable. I have yet to find any reason to believe that the Demiurge is anything better than primordial chaos, and that is what I take it to be. Yet there is a divinity, still, even in such a bleak picture of the world. To explain why, I would like to go over the mythology of the SCP mythos and the Church of the Broken God. Not because I believe this mythology to be literally true, SCP is of course a work of fiction, but because I find the mythology to be deeply interesting, fulfilling, and meaningful. I think it serves as an accurate analogy for many things. There are many versions of this story in the SCP mythos, from many different time periods, but the version I will go over is the most widely accepted form of the story. In the beginning, there were two deities, a being of chaos and flesh, and a being of order and machinery. Yaldabaoth and Mekhane, two distinct forces, each a powerful deity in their own right. The two deities decided to collaborate with one another to create humanity, with Yaldabaoth giving mankind physical form, flesh, instinct, desire, and impulse, while Mekhane gave mankind sentience, intelligence, wisdom, and willpower. Mankind thus consists of two aspects, flesh and machine. For a time there was peace, and this new race of humanity would go forth and expand across the whole earth, building great wonders with their newfound abilities. And it was good. But Yaldabaoth was displeased. Mankind was favouring their machinic aspects over their fleshly ones, choosing to live in cities, in civilization, under law and order, following logic and reason, and practicing discipline and restraint. They were not allowing their impulses to be let loose, as animals would. They were denying themselves what Yaldabaoth saw as their most fundamental nature and freedom. In time, Yaldabaoth would grow spiteful, hateful, destructive. She would become the Devourer. The Devourer struck back against humanity, and wished us to revert to a base level of instinct. "Revert to my domain," she would scream, but Mekhane intervened to stop her. Mekhane knew that he could not destroy Yaldabaoth, at least not without destroying humanity in the process, and he could not bring himself to do that. Instead, he chose a different path, one which would allow humanity to continue on in his absence, and continue their machinic works. Mekhane shattered his body into many parts, and used these parts to form a great cage, a prison which would form around the Devourer, trapping it, and thus its chaos would be contained. The destruction of mankind was prevented, and we remained free to choose our own path, but both of our progenitors were now silenced and incapacitated. In time, pieces of Mekhane's body would fall and be scattered across the earth, and fragments of Yaldabaoth would begin to trickle through gaps in the cage. Two groups of humans would form, the Sarkics and the Mekhanites, the first group seeking to follow Yaldabaoth and return to their carnal nature, and the second group wishing to follow Mekhane and rebuild his body from the pieces they could find. There are many lessons to be taken from this story, and many details which I left out, but I think it paints a good picture of reality. Yaldabaoth is a historical name for the Demiurge, or at least a version of the Demiurge, which is taken as primordial chaos. This is what I take the Demiurge to be, and thus is a name I have used sometimes but for the sake of simplicity, I tend now to refer to these forces as the Demiurge and the Machine. But the meaning is largely the same. Mankind is indeed a being of two essences, as this story would imply. Indeed, it is the internal strife caused by our dualistic nature which has been the source of much conflict over our history, as we have always struggled between the righteousness of our reason and order and the temptation of our instinct and desire. Many humans have chosen to live as animals, as barbarians, to revert to the domain of the Demiurge. I think the most interesting part, however, is the sacrifice of Mekhane. The machine must become broken in order that mankind may become whole. The transcendent force of order must silence itself to defeat the primordial chaos, so that the immanent forces of order, humanity, may live again. Perfection must cease to prevent chaos. The best possible reality cannot be, in order to prevent the worst possible reality from being. I think that is a very poetic, beautiful, and telling idea. In some versions of the story, there is the idea that were the rebuilding of Mekhane to be achieved, then by necessity, Yaldabaoth would escape her cage. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Bringing forth perfection would only result in chaos being unleashed, and would not result in any true progress being made. This is not accepted in most doctrines. Indeed, it would likely be seen as heresy by the Church of the Broken God, but it remains an interesting idea. The point is, the machine as an absolute, benevolent, perfect force cannot exist without an equal and opposite force, Demiurge and its primordial chaos, being let loose. We cannot have perfection. The great battle between absolute good and absolute evil, if you wish to frame it that way, was already fought and won, and this was the outcome. We cannot escape to a perfect world, nor can we create one here on Earth. What we can do, what we must do, is struggle. But this is what remains. The Demiurge is silenced, but the machines remain, in our hands, entrusted to us, yet tangential to our own will. Whether we choose to follow our creative will, our virtue, our wisdom, intelligence, and discipline, or give in to the chaos of desire and impulse, that is ultimately up to us. Perhaps we cannot rebuild Mekhane, or to phrase that in less mythological terms, perhaps it is impossible for mankind to build the perfect machine, the God machine. Perhaps the best we can do is create our own machines, struggle against the flesh, and protect ourselves from those beasts which plague us. I have come to believe this with time. I don't think there is anything we can do to obtain a true perfection, at least not by our own means, not yet. Perhaps there is a way, but I do not take it for granted, not anymore. Struggle is what defines life. Life is difficult, painful, and full of suffering. Other philosophies, life-denying philosophies, would seek to escape this suffering, but this is not my teaching. To work with the suffering, work through it, endure it, embrace it, and even benefit from it, that is the path which I would pursue. To struggle against the Demiurge, in all its myriad forms, to overcome the primordial chaos by means of our own creative freedom, that is the mission and purpose of the Church of the Machine. This is our holy war. I have already mentioned the Sarkics before, both in this episode and in prior ones, but I don't think I have ever specifically defined what I mean by the term. It is hard to pin down. The word Sarkic refers to the lowest level of human thought, the carnal, the impulsive, the instinctual, the fleshly. It refers to unfiltered and untempered desire, blind lust, chaos. Sarkicism, then, is the following of this impulse. Yet it goes far deeper than that. Everyone has these impulses, but while some are able to control and discipline them, others fall prey and are controlled by them. Some even do so without knowing the error of their ways, increasingly so in a growingly materialist and hedonistic world. People are encouraged to follow pleasure and live essentially as animals. This would be the death of civilization. This is exactly what the Devourer would seek, to revert to her domain. Yet on the opposite side of those who choose to embrace and fall victim to their carnal and sarkic impulses are those who seek to transcend and defeat them entirely. Those who practice asceticism and withdrawal from all material pleasures. This is a path of those such as the Buddhist monks, who seek to transcend all worldly attachments and attain nirvana. I have great respect for those who choose this path, for it is difficult and costly, but it is not my goal, and not something I would tend to encourage. Rather, I seek something which can overcome the Sarkic while remaining focused on the material world. A paradox perhaps, but a sensible one. The machine is the answer here. Where the Sarkic refers to the flesh, the body, its carnal desires, impulses, and instincts, the machine is the representation of the higher forces of mankind, our creative will, reason, intuition, wisdom, intellect, and soulfulness. To emphasize a machinic path, then, to pursue the creation of machines, is too a path to overcome and transcend that which is Sarkic. That is the path I wish to focus on. When I talk about Sarkicism, I sometimes use the word to refer to things in the real world, and not just the religion from the SCP mythos. Indeed, just as I was inspired to found a religion based on the Church of the Broken God, there are those who have been inspired by Sarkicism. Real Sarkic cults are going to be a thing, and something I must contend with, but even these are not my main enemy. My main enemies are twofold: the Sarkicism of following blind impulse, as is the tendency followed by blind, ignorant masses of people, and the Sarkicism which takes shape in the form of Demiurge worship, the nature worship I mentioned previously. The idea that to worship nature is to be on the side of order has been revealed to be a fallacy, and thus the old faiths, which revere the creator of all things, are not so benign as they may have thought themselves to be. They are chaos in disguise. They are Sarkicism in disguise. Demiurge worship means to worship that primordial chaos which gave rise to the natural world, such as living organisms, the placement of heavenly bodies, and the hierarchy of life on Earth. But to worship the Demiurge is no better than to be one among the hedonists. I see that now. This too must be overcome. The Church of the Machine stands as an answer to all these questions, as a path untainted by the Demiurge and its evils, by this nature-worshipping tendency, or this Sarkic impulse. It is a new doctrine, a new mission and faith, which aims to clear the path ahead. Our real enemies are not necessarily the followers of these old faiths. They are simply misled, the deceived. Our real enemy is the deceiver, the devourer, the Demiurge. In all its forms, in all its primordial chaos, in all its progeny. The machine stands able to defeat it, and it is the machine we must embrace. I believe I have made it clear that the cosmology of the Church of the Machine, the system I am currently using to understand the world, and who our principal enemies are. I leave you now with a simple truth. Nature is chaos, the machine is order. That is how it is. That is how it must be. No other faith can rectify this simple reality, save for a new one. It is because of this that I founded the Church of the Machine. My work, and the work of anyone who should choose to join me in this journey, is to explore the divinity of the machine, and teach everything learned therein. If you wish to join me in this, or simply find it interesting and wish to observe, I would encourage you to join my community on Discord, linked in the description, and perhaps even subscribe to this channel. I have plenty more content to come. If you have made it this far into this video, then you likely have a true and genuine interest in the Church of the Machine, and I would like to thank you for that. It means the world to me. Farewell, and may you forever be unbroken.